All right, so we're going to continue our lesson. And what is interesting is it was a perfect stopping point last class, because now we're going to shift gears to the more empirical aspect of the antecedents to psychology. So just as a running start, the concept of empiricism is that we gather knowledge through direct observation and or sensory experience. You will notice that some of the earliest psychologists or psychology researchers studied sensation and perception. So sensory experience was important. And when empiricism takes hold on the development of the discipline, it removes the dogma and church doctrine that we talked about in the last lecture. And ultimately, Descartes becomes that symbol of shifting from purely theology to philosophy and free scientific thinking. So who was René Descartes? Well, he was born in France, pretty wealthy, and that financial stability allowed him to dip and dabble in a bunch of different things. So he was well-traveled. He pursued intellectual activities, scientific pursuits. He, generally speaking, wanted to make sure that there was a university anywhere he traveled to. That was one of his things. And ultimately, he started to focus on things like applied research, such as linking mathematics to science, and that was the source of knowledge. Now, he also felt that dreams were some form of prophecy, and he said he experienced, quote, a spirit of truth, which convinced him that mathematical principles could be applied to all sciences. And that is true. We ultimately do apply mathematics as one of our approaches to analyzing data. Now, if you think that this is a foreign idea, that the dreams can impact, who you are and what you should be doing, Descartes was not the only person. Carl Jung also believed that dreams were a way of tapping into unconscious mystical experiences. So, generally speaking, he lived a life of solitude, bounced around a bit, but always, as I said, he wanted to live near a university and a Catholic church, which is interesting because religion was very important to him, but scholarship and intellectual curiosity was very important to him. So no matter where he went, he tried to make sure that he had these resources. Now, at the end of his life, he was teaching Queen Christina in Sweden philosophy. Usually they had very long sessions, and the heating wasn't what it is today. I want you to envision an old stone castle with drafts and very damp feelings. So one suggestion is that is what caused him to become ill. Now, after his death, his body stayed in Sweden for 16 years, and then they tried to transport it back to France, his home country. But they tried to put him in a coffin, and it was ultimately too short. So they decapitated him. His head was left in Sweden. The rest of the body starts its journey back to France. It gets to France, and the French minister decides to cut off a finger, and he keeps it as a souvenir, which is, I mean, all of this is somewhat morbid, but this was his sojournings after death, so to speak. And then what happened to his head? His skull was in Sweden for quite some time. It was passed around. Collectors bought it and passed around for about 150 years. And eventually it was reunited with his body some 150 years later. And you might say, oh, well, why the souvenir, the pinky and the skull and all of these things? Now, it was a different time period, certainly. The medieval times were quite different, and then the Renaissance was quite different than where we are today. But if you think, we also have our souvenirs and things that we keep, like Babe Ruth's baseball. If you have one of his baseballs, it tends to, have value, and it's a collector's item because of his iconic status. And the same thing during the time of philosophy. Philosophy was big. So Descartes had iconic status the same way, let's say, Babe Ruth has iconic status in baseball. Now, I saw a hand was raised, Rosa Maria.
I also learned that during the Renaissance, they would eat dead people, mummified people as well.
That is interesting. I'm not.
Because they believed, especially if it was an intelligent person, they believed that they consumed like that person's corpse, then they would become intelligent or gain a specialty. Like if it was a famous artist or painter, that they would become an artist or something like that.
That's not an uncommon belief set. I didn't know what you're saying as this is being, prototypical in the Renaissance, but so yeah, it was a different time period. There was a more morbid time period. You think of kings and queens, displaying bodies on Trader Gate and hanging them and things like that. That is not as popular, right? We treat remains differently today. So that being said, I appreciate the additional context. So Descartes, Descartes was he was a game changer in trying to understand what's called the mind-body problem. And basically, the body was representative of the physical world, and the mind was representative of the mental world. And the mind and the soul were used interchangeably at this point and earlier points in history. And I think that's important to understand, because we talked about Socrates and Aristotle and so forth, and Plato, and we talked about the soul, but the soul was that eternal aspect of the mind and stores those memories and information. So, but before Descartes, we believed in something called monism, which is a one-directional way where the mind influences the body, but it's not a two-way street. Descartes comes around and he says, yeah, no, that's not true. There's a mutual interaction. So the mind influences the body, but the body also influences the mind. And there's a communication and an interaction between the two. And that's important information. Can anyone give me an example of how the mind influences the body? Okay.
I have an example, Professor.
Sure.
If someone is depressed, then they're less likely to eat or exercise, so their muscles can atrophy.
Right. So depression leading to reduced movement. That's the mind influence in the body, because then you have muscle atrophy. Jenna?
If somebody is really anxious, they can become like nauseous, and it can affect the way that like they can get like headaches and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Can it also be positive thing?
Explain what you mean.
Like, I don't know, for instance, say working out, your mind is essentially doing a lot more of the work than your body is, limitations and all that.
Yeah. It could be. It could be. I'll take one more. I see I have a couple hands up. Who feel free, whoever wants to go.
When
Oh.
we are stressed or anxious, we might like develop higher blood pressure or ulcers or something like that.
Yeah. So that's the mind influencing the body. But on a neuroscience, a basic neuroscience level, when we think about it, the mind influences the body every time we choose to take notes. So I'm lecturing and you're taking notes. Every time you're taking notes, there has to be a message from the mind to the body to take those notes. And again, we look at the mind differently. We look at the mind as being located in the brain, and it's not devoid of the body today. But so when you're writing notes, that is your motor cortex sending a message from the brain to the body to take the notes. But Descartes said that makes sense. And even before him, people acknowledged that the mind influences the body. And they felt like it's kind of like the mind was the puppeteer of the body. But when Descartes came around, he said, no, the body can influence the mind as well. And how's that work?
Well, that would be it. Someone said something similar to it, but like working out can make you less stressed or like less anxious about anything else that's going on in your life.
Yeah, and absolutely. And then even things like reflexes, right? So if you are cooking and you are talking on the phone and you're not paying attention to where you place your hand, what's going to happen reflexively is that you are going to recoil your hand. You're going to pull your hand back. But there is still a message that goes up to the brain and says, yeah, maybe you don't want to keep your hand that close to the fire. So that sensory input that's going up to the brain is the body influencing the mind. So, and it's a two-way street. And I think neuroscience does a good job at explaining this. So monism, again, monism was the belief that there's only one reality, and then there are subdivisions of this. Physical monism, that's the belief that everything can be explained in physical terms. Idealists explain everything in terms of consciousness. And if you look at it, the root is idea or thought. Idealists, we have consciousness. Now, a dualist tries to link physical and mental events together. Now, that being said, we want to try and understand how Descartes understood the body. So Descartes believed that the body was physical, had the capacity for movement, operated based on the laws of physics and mechanics, which is actually pretty cool, because when we think of muscle movement, you can think of flexion and extension, right? And it operates similar to this. It's not a bad idea. Now, he also felt that nerves operate like hollow pipes or tubes, and animal spirits flowed through them. Now, he got this one wrong, because when we talk about nerves or neurons, they are not hollow like tubes, and we don't have a liquid flowing through them. What he probably did in order to come up with this like liquid flowing through hollow tubes, he probably was influenced by the hydraulic system of the automata, right? That these machines that could do human-like properties, as we talked in the last lecture. But in addition, when you think of veins and arteries and blood flow, he probably conflated, blood flow with neuronal communication. Now, he did come up with something that was very meaningful, the reflex action theory, that suggests that some environmental stimulus or external object can trigger an involuntary response, a reflex, right? So we don't need to think about pulling our hand away from a fire. That is a reflexive action, and then the thought happens later. So the reflex action theory was pretty powerful. And some of what he said were adopted by the French materialists, and we're going to talk more about materialism again this week. So what did he get support from in his ideas? Well, we talked about these hollow tubes. Circulation of blood works that way. Now, it wasn't the nerves, it was blood, right? That flows through these tubes. Muscles work in opposite pairs like a pulley system, flexion, extension. And sensations and movement depend on neurons or nerves. Got it all right. Now, in terms of Christian theology, he stated that animals have no soul, lacked immortality, lacked thought, like higher order thinking and free will. Now, it's interesting that he didn't say they lacked emotions, but that higher order thought process, he did say they lacked. And they lack free will because they're governed by more primitive and primal instincts. So some researchers adopted this belief set, and they ultimately would work on animals and do animal research without anesthesia, something that we would consider unethical today. The research ethics boards would never allow that. But there was a time when we understood animals differently than we do today. And everything could be explained in terms of a mechanistic approach or machine-like for animals. Now, so that was how Descartes understood the body. Now, the mind, it was non-material, right? So it didn't have a physical substance. It had the capacity to think, perceive, and have willpower or free will. It was unitary. So the belief was that the mind and the body met at one specific focal point, which we're going to say is the pineal gland, but the brain in general was the focal point. And ultimately, the mind allows us to process information about the outside world. And unlike before him, where they had this puppeteer belief that the mind only influences the body, it both influences and is influenced by the body, which was what we defined as dualism. Now, I mentioned to you that the brain was the source or location where the mind and the body met. So where in the brain? The pineal gland or the canarium. Now, he felt that it was a single unitary physical structure that served as a bridge between the two. Now, what's interesting is that why did Descartes pick the pineal gland? It was dark and mysterious. That was the extent of his rationale. There wasn't necessarily a good reason for him picking the pineal gland. Very little was understood about it. It was mysterious, so he thought maybe it had this bridging capacity. Now, how did this interaction occur? So these animal spirits flew through these nerve tubes and they pressed upon the pineal gland, right? And then at that point, the mind produced a sensation and then sent a message from the pineal gland down to the body for voluntary movement and things like that. Now, this is a prototype of a drawing. You could see very, very primitive. If we look at A, that's a person or a fire that's next to a person's foot. So B, we have the body, right? There is some kind of message from the fire that suggests that there is heat. That travels all the way up to F, which is the pineal gland, and then it travels back down. Now, these so-called animal spirits, and now you're probably like, what are they? It's an undefined substance that traveled through the tubes, right? We don't have that substance. It's not a real substance, but that's why we refer to it the way we do, because that's how he described it. But what's interesting is that it's one tube up and the same tube down. And that's not exactly how it works today. We have sensory fiber tracts and motor fiber tracts that travel up and down from in particular, our descending motor tracts go from the motor cortex down to the spinal cord in the body. And then we have our somatosensory cortex up there, which receives messages of touch and pain. So it's different. We don't see it as one pathway, one tube. But again, it did add some understanding as to how the mind and the body were working together. And it moved us into a better discussion. So a lot of the discussions we talk about in neuroscience, actually, we can credit Descartes to some degree because of getting us started. Even though he got it wrong, we still should give him some credit because he got us started in terms of trying to explain this bidirectional relationship. That he got right. So in terms of ideas are part of the mind. So there are different kinds of ideas. So derived ideas are ideas that are formulated through experience, right? So things that happen in your life, things that happen in the environment, the external world, they are a derived idea. That's how we formulate new ideas based on experience. However, you may remember when we talked about Socrates that I said Descartes aligns with Socrates. Remember when Socrates said knowledge is innate? Well, Descartes believed in the doctrine of innate ideas. So he believed that we are born with certain foundational knowledge, and that is passed on from in reincarnation to the next. And things like our understanding of the self, perfection, the abstract understanding of infinity. These are all things that are we inherit and we're born with, according to Descartes. So he adopted this idea, or a nativist idea, of perception, the theory of perception, suggesting that perception is an innate process, right? So we have the natural ability to perceive. and Gestalt psychologists, which we'll talk a little bit about in lecture 5, absolutely adopted some of this. The phenomenological perspective that's in Gestalt psychology assumes that there's some kind of innate knowledge here. However, opposition also grew in the form of John Locke, right? John Locke was one of the earliest critics of this nativist perspective of perception. Now, John Locke was a critic that we're born with any knowledge. So he took it to the opposite extreme, that we're born empty, devoid of any kind of knowledge, and everything is learned through experience. But other people like Helmholtz, which has a theory of vision and audition, these are senses, right? Two of our primary senses. He did not believe that was innate. So Helmholtz rejected the notion of innate ideas. And Wundt, right, the father of psychology, rejected the idea that our perception was innate. Now, if this were a developmental psychology class, I would have a little bit of fun with this, because what we see is that some senses are hardwired at birth and some senses become more refined through time. So things like taste, smell, and touch are well developed even at birth. So these senses are linked to Descartes, right? So these three senses would provide support for Descartes, whereas vision, hearing, and the sixth sense of balance, not intuition, but balance, those are refined and further developed in infancy. So they're not fully acquired at birth. So if you're wondering, well, who was right? Was it Descartes, which suggests that these sensation and perceptions occur and we're wired with them at birth? He has a few senses to support him. If we're suggesting that it needs to be developed and acquired through experience during infancy, John Locke would have support in vision, hearing, and balance, right? So it's not so simple. Now, my favorite philosopher is Immanuel Kant, which suggests that both are partially true, that we need both a priori and a posteriori knowledge, right? So we're born with some things, but it's an incomplete knowledge that we're born with that the environment has to further develop or shape. So Immanuel Kant resolves the debate that way. And ultimately, if we're talking about things like sensation and perception, we're more in line with Immanuel Kant than either of the two, John Locke or Descartes. It's pretty interesting when you think about it, that philosophers were talking about some of the very same things we're doing, but the only difference between philosophers and what I'm saying is, I'm relying on research in developmental psychology, vision research, hearing or audition research, and all of these things. I'm relying on the research, whereas it was more of a speculative practice up to the time of Descartes. All right, so let's try and put it all together and say, well, what are the contributions that Descartes did to the development of psychology? Well, his mechanistic understanding or concept of the body, that is a meaningful contribution. His theory of reflex action, that's a meaningful contribution. The interaction between the mind and the body, meaningful contribution. the concept of localization in the brain. Now, localization in the brain, we didn't really flesh out when I was explaining about the pineal gland, but localization in the brain suggests that each part of the brain has a distinct function. It has a purpose, it does something. And the assumption that the pineal gland was the seat of the soul, so to speak, the bridge between the mind and the body, suggests that that was its purpose. So localization in the brain, he added to, and the doctrine of innate ideas, things like reflexes. These kind of things are not learned. They're innate. We don't need to tell ourselves to blink. We don't need to tell ourselves to breathe. We don't need to tell ourselves to digest our food. These happen without any conscious effort. Does that mean we cannot control some of these things? Sure, I can impact the rate of my breathing, or whether I'm blinking or not. I can control that voluntarily, but it is naturally a reflex to protect us. So some of the things that are reflexive in nature, also we give Descartes credit for acknowledging. So let's shift gears from Descartes to really what's happening in Northern Europe at this point, in England and France at the time, where they're trying to really create a science. So the European philosophy that emerged at this time period shifts us away from speculation. And Auguste Comte, which you probably have heard that name before, maybe in sociology as well, he adopted the principle of positivism, which is the acknowledgement of only natural phenomena, or only directly observable phenomena. So if you cannot observe it, you cannot, it's not worth studying. So his phrase was that he emphasizes objects of sense, things that can actually be observed or measured, versus things that are nonsense. And when he said nonsense, it wasn't a knock on it. It just wasn't observable or measurable. So he didn't want to study that. He didn't want to do research on that because you cannot quantify it. And remember Auguste Comte's name, because when we get to John Watson and the behaviorist took this to the extreme. So the radical behaviorists like John Watson adopted Auguste Comte's idea. And one of their criticisms of psychoanalysis was the unconscious. So he said, just like you can't measure the existence of a soul, you can't measure the unconscious. Therefore, it's outside the purview of the science of psychology. So this European philosophy that we're talking about in the end of the 1700s and through the middle of the 1800s, and then up to the early 1900s, you're starting to see influence someone like John Watson. Okay, so materialism. Now, in terms of this understanding of materialism, materialism is focusing on things in the universe that can be explained in physical terms, such as matter. So materialism, there has to be a physical element to it. So if you're thinking of consciousness, you're going to want to understand through terms of things like physics and chemistry. And it's interesting because with this point of materialism, I want you to think of Titchener. And Titchener studies consciousness. Titchener is a student of Wundt. And he he understood the mind very similar to chemistry. And he tried to identify what he referred to as mental elements, just like the physical periodical table of elements. So you're seeing this European mindset of empiricism, materialism, and all of these different elements come to play and influence the beginning philosophies of the science. So, what are mental processes? Well, mental processes can be explained due to some brain structure or physiological process that occurs. So, the argument was neuroanatomy or neurophysiology is at play, and these are the factors that are impacting mental processes. Not wrong, not wrong at all. The only thing that they're missing is neurochemistry, neurotransmitters. But those elements that they listed are indeed true. So again, we talk about empiricism, pursuit of knowledge through direct observation, and knowledge comes from our experience or sensory experience, and it is more of an objective observation process. So if we were to look at these three elements, and I know I listed them earlier in the lesson as well, but positivism, materialism, and empiricism has the most impact in terms of shaping the developing field of psychology. So let's talk a little bit about John Locke. I mentioned his name, and I mentioned him as kind of the pushback to Descartes. So a little bit about who he was. He was also a scholar, also a philosopher, but he knew other things like Greek, right? So he studied Greek. He dabbled in philosophy, and he was a physician. So he practiced medicine at Oxford, and eventually he becomes a counselor. If I'm thinking of Game of Thrones, the hand of the king, so to speak, right? He became interested in politics and started to become the major advisor or confidant to the Earl of Shaftesbury. Now, when the Earl decides that he's going to try and overthrow King Charles II, John Locke leaves. He skips town because that is treason, and he could be punished by death. So the fact that he was a confidant of the Earl of Shaftesbury made him a target. Ultimately, things do quiet down, and he's able to return to England and, continue dabbling in politics, religion, economics, things like that. We use the phrase Renaissance man. John Locke is the prototype of a Renaissance man. He did a little bit of everything, and he was competent in a little bit of everything. So I think it's important to appreciate all the things that John Locke dabbled in. Now, his mindset was similar to libertarians, right? So if we think of the Libertarian Party in the United States, it's a very light and uninvolved government. So he believed that people should be self-governing, and the government should keep their hands off as much as possible. And these attitudes do influence the framers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So eventually he writes his magnum opus, an essay concerning human understanding. And he basically puts 20 years of scholarship together for this particular manuscript. And as in this manuscript, he champions empiricism. So you might hear the term British empiricist. Well, that comes from John Locke. So we'll see that, and I'll get to them shortly, but you'll see that there are a whole host of British scholars that follow, that adopt his mindset of empiricism, and reject the notion of innate ideas, right? So if you suggest that Descartes was wrong, though, and you suggest that innate ideas are not there, how do you explain seemingly innate knowledge? So he argued that it's due to early learning and motor habit or habits. So instead of suggesting that this you were born with it, it was due to early learning. And this argument is hard to disprove because we are not good at measuring what's happening in the womb, right? So even reflexes, which we suggest as unlearned processes, they don't need to be taught. We don't know what's happening in the womb that might shape the acquisition of reflexes. So it's a good theoretical argument, but it's not a testable theoretical argument, at least at this point. Now, I mentioned the term tabula rasa when I was talking to you about Aristotle. Aristotle did not believe that knowledge is passed on from reincarnation to the next. Rather, you're born empty, and our knowledge is acquired through empirical observation. So this idea that John Locke has of the tabula rasa, while he's getting credit for the phrase, is not a new one, because philosophers that predate him also believed that knowledge was acquired through experience and observation. So what kind of experiences do we have? We have sensations and reflections. So sensations, they tend to be more external, or it's input from external physical objects as sense impressions on the mind. Now, you might hear the term sensation and perception. So the way he's describing sensation is something happening in the physical world that activates a sense organ. Now that makes sense, right? And his argument is sensations come before reflections. So what are reflections? That's when your mind processes further these sensory impressions. Now, what's interesting, his word reflections, we would refer to as perception, right? Sensation and perception. Today, that's how we would refer to it. But these reflections are not happening, or not just influenced by direct physical experience, but these reflections are influenced by past experiences as well, and our, ability to put this new experience into context relative to everything else we've experienced. So reflections allow us to become more abstract, allow us to categorize a little more, and have higher order thinking. So this results in ideas, and we talk about simple and complex ideas. So simple ideas from this point of view is just something that arises directly from a sensation or a reflection. It is a passive process, it's received passively, and it cannot be reduced further. So it's simple in that it's at its basic explanation or basic understanding. Whereas complex ideas, they're a combination of multiple simple ideas. They tend to occur through reflection, that analytical process where I described you're categorizing and putting this new experience against past experience. But complex ideas can be further reduced or further analyzed to more simplistic ideas. So you might think about it as like chemistry. You have one element by itself, another element connected to it, and now you have a new structure, right? So when we think of water, it's two hydrogen molecules and one oxygen molecule that gets put together to become something entirely different, which we call water. So that would be the complex, so to speak, putting it all together. Now, how do we learn? Again, learning occurs through association. Now, what is association? That's the ability to link multiple experiences together. So in the sense of John Locke, we would be linking multiple simple ideas and converting them into more complex ideas. And he applies the law of association, similar to the laws of mechanics, right? Ideas can be constructed and deconstructed, right? So ideas are assembled, disassembled, reassembled very mechanically. And ultimately, simple ideas are kind of like the small structures, the atoms of the mind. Remember this phrase, simple ideas are atoms of the mind, because when we get to Sigmund Freud, he talks about the unconscious, but there was this gentleman that predated him, which took this principle of atoms of the mind, and he called them mental elements or monads. And this gentleman's name was Leibniz. So Leibniz adopted this idea of atoms of the mind, and how is it that things from the unconscious break through to the conscious, according to Leibniz, is that they bind together, and the force of all of these atoms of the mind, they break through the threshold, and then we become aware of something from the unconscious. So we also talk about things like primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are objective or independent qualities. These are intrinsic to the object, things like size and shape, right? We can quantify these, we can measure them. And then we also have secondary qualities, things like color or odor or taste, sound, temperature. All of these secondary qualities require a person to perceive them, and they're subject to interpretation, subject to one's experience. So they are not objective in nature. So the only qualities that can exist independent of us perceiving them are primary qualities, right? So you might have heard the phrase, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if you're taking this literally, you would say secondary qualities, things like sound, requires a perceiver, someone to hear it and process that sound. And the answer would be no, right? Because it's a secondary quality. Now, George Berkeley, born in Ireland, became a deacon, became very wealthy, ultimately was funded by a philanthropist, and he basically lived out his life. You might have heard of Berkeley University. It's named after him. And one of his philosophies was that he wanted his flesh to decompose before being buried. And that was for more of a spiritual belief set. Now, so George Berkeley is part of this British empiricist movement. So he agrees with John Locke that knowledge comes through experience. And he suggests that perception is the only reality. And it's interesting because Berkeley differs somewhat than Locke regarding primary qualities then. So if perception is the only reality, we're relying on someone to perceive that, some subjective entity to experience it. So those objective qualities like size and shape that Locke said, Berkeley rejected. And he said, if you cannot experience it, or if it is not experienced, it doesn't exist, is probably a better way of saying it. Now, in terms of his belief set, he has this concept of mentalism. So all of our knowledge is subject to the perceiving person. And there's no objective truth. There's only a subjective truth. And our experience does not necessarily have to match the world around us. When we get to Gestalt philosophies, this subjective reality being your reality, they adopt this principle as well. Now, so what is the physical world? The physical world as we know it, or as George Berkeley knew it, is a combination of all of our sensory experiences. So how is it possible that John Locke could suggest that there are these independent qualities independent of the perceiving person? Well, the answer is God. According to George Berkeley, God is the permanent perceiver, and God is the source that creates the appearance of stability, the appearance of consistency, the appearance of independence. But if God were to withdraw from the universe, then all of this stability and consistency would disappear, right? So very theologically or spiritually driven was his mindset. Now, the association of sensations in this point of view is mechanical, right? So knowledge is constructed from simple ideas which are fused together, and that's how we acquire it. So if you were to look at vision research, how do we perceive depth perception? The answer is binocular vision. Binocular, two eyes which have different focal points that are overlaid and converge, and ultimately that becomes our visual experience in terms of depth. But if a person were to I don't know, have an issue with a detached retina or lose vision in one eye, it will affect their depth perception. So this is a basic example of how you would associate two bits of information for a more complex experience. David Hume is another one of the British empiricists, philosopher, historian, tried to pursue law, but backed out of it. And ultimately, we know him because of his writings, such as A Treatise of Human Nature. So Hume agrees with John Locke that simple ideas bind together or compound into complex ideas. He agreed in this mentalistic philosophy, but where he differed from Berkeley was he did not really adopt this permanent perceiver, and God is the creator of consistency. Now, he took one's experience to the opposite extreme, that all we know is our experience. So David Hume suggests that the only reality we know is our perception. And it very well could be that there is no world outside of our perception. So the real world may not exist. We don't know. And from a mentalistic point of view, the only thing that we can know is what we're thinking, and anything outside of one's own mind cannot be proven definitively. Now, this is great in terms of philosophy because it really caps, the conclusions we draw. We don't draw any significant generalizations because we can't even verify its true nature. Now, my response to someone like David Hume would be, so you don't believe that the real world exists? It may exist, may not exist. So let's do a physical test. I want you to walk in the middle of traffic on the freeway, on a highway, and just stand there. And most people would sober up and have a sense of like belief in the real world. They would say, yeah, philosophically, this is true, but I don't want to take the risk. Well, if you don't want to take the risk, then you're not fully endorsing this idea that nothing exists beyond your own mind. People say, how do we know that this whole experience, maybe we're just part of someone else's imagination? And they speculate, but no one's willing to take the risk that is true. So in terms of mental content, there's impressions and ideas. Hume's phrase of impressions were basically sensation and perceptions. These experiences that we talked about John Locke, right? Now, their experience is stronger in terms of imagery than ideas. Now, what are ideas? So ideas are the information that we hold on to even after the experience. So the concept of a flower or a rose, we can mentally picture that rose, even though I'm not holding a rose up. And that's the power of ideas, is that we're able to, through our mind, continue to appreciate whatever the impression is, whatever our experience was, even in the absence of the object. Now, these ideas can either be simple or complex. Again, complex doesn't mean it's very, very sophisticated or difficult. All it means is that we're associating multiple ideas together. That's all it is. So the law of association, or law, we have several factors that drive association. So the law of similarity or resemblance suggests that the more similar two ideas are, two even objects are, the more likely we're going to connect them together. So I'll give you an example. If you were categorizing, cognitive psychologists would say, if I say cat, dog, fill in the blank, you're likely going to give me another animal, right? You're not going to say cat, dog, ball. Even though a cat and a dog can play with a ball, the similarity is based on them being animals. So the third object that you're going to list is likely going to be another animal because they resemble one another more. They're more similar. We also understand the power of time. The closer things occur in time, the easier they are to be associated. The law of contiguity is absolutely critical in conditioning, whether it be classical conditioning or operant conditioning. The closer the two stimuli are paired together, or the closer the behavior and the consequence are paired together, the more likely you're going to learn that association. So being closer in time results in making easier connections. David Hartley, again, he was going to become a minister. But, keep in mind the philosophies at that time is if you're going to become a minister, you have to adopt the belief set of the church. But he was critical, asked too many questions, and ultimately they did not feel comfortable ordaining him. So he has to switch crafts to make a living, and he switches into the medical field. He's a physician like several other philosophers we talked about, but he dabbled in philosophy on his own. So his major work was observations on man, his frame, his duty, and expectations, which was all about associations. So agrees, again, British empiricist. This is why I keep mentioning all these people. They share the same philosophy of knowledge is acquired through experience, right? British empiricists. Now, in terms of contiguity, he has Hartley's basic law of association, but instead of just pairing two stimuli together, he starts to pair more cognitive processes like memory and analytical thinking, and then also emotions, which you wouldn't ordinarily think to pair through contiguity. He starts to pair them. And I'll give you a good example of this in terms of cognitive psychology. There's something called mood congruent memory. If you're in a good mood, you're going to encode that experience of that day more favorably than if you're in a bad mood. If you're in a bad mood, you're also more likely to access more negative memories. So these are examples of how things get put together, even on a cognitive or emotional level. Now, he adds another law of association through repetition. So the more times that ideas link together or occur together, more likely you're going to associate them. When we're studying for tests, the more times we review our notes, the more we're going to make connections between different parts of our notes. So the law of association by repetition, although it wasn't stated prior, is legitimate, and we call it rehearsal, right, or repetition. As I said, he was an empiricist like John Locke. So if you were to try and understand how we operate, our thinking and judgment and reasoning as adults can be broken down to earlier experiences or more simplistic experiences we had at an earlier point in time. Now, this is interesting because, he's putting an emphasis on childhood shaping adolescence and adulthood, which is not a point of conflict for psychoanalysts. They would agree with this idea of this developmental research. And then, as I said, his theory of association usually was linked to physical things, but Hartley linked it to all mental activities like memory and decision making and so forth. So he adds a little bit. So if I were to ask you a question on a test, which of the following did Hartley add to the British empiricists, right? Law of association, dualism, or law of repetition, you would probably pick law of repetition, right? Because that's what he uses to link mental activity. So in terms of mechanism or the mindset of mechanism, so he applied mechanical principles to everything physiological, And these physiological processes are the driving forces for psychology. Now, what's interesting, if we're keeping score as well, is we keep mentioning physiological concepts. So you're going to see in lecture 3, we talk about the German physiologists, but the German physiologists, they're impacted by British empiricism as well, and you'll see that as well. So in terms of nerves, he did not believe that you had these hollow tubes, but rather nerves were solid strings that vibrated. So he differed from Descartes. Now, this is not true either. So these idea that our nerves are strings that are almost like you pluck a string on a guitar and it vibrates, and that's how we transmit nerve impulses. It's not true, right? So, but nevertheless, that was his belief set. So each of these vibrations triggers smaller vibrations in the brain and serves as the trigger for perception. Now, James Mill and John Stuart Mill, you're going to hear about, but James Mill was educated in Scotland, started as a clergyman, and then quit. And he quit because when he would give his sermons, people were bewildered or puzzled. They didn't get it. And if you're going to be someone who's on a pulpit, you need to be someone like Joel Osteen. And I'm not celebrating Joel Osteen. I have my criticisms of him too, but he speaks, his sermons in a very simplistic, everyday language. James Mill didn't do that. So he lost his congregants and they just didn't get him. So he said, this is not working for me. So then he starts to dabble in philosophy, right? So, and he writes the analysis of the phenomenon of the human mind. And he uses the language of the mind as a machine. You might think of people like Julien de Lemaitre, remember him, who wrote a book similar to this. And ultimately, he wanted to only adopt objective ideas, and anything that was subjective in nature, he wanted to get rid of. And he suggested that empiricists that only said the mind is similar to a machine didn't go far enough. He felt that the mind was a machine. And the mind is passive and it reacts to environmental stimuli. And because of this, there's no place for free will. And this should sound a lot like B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner believed that you can program people to behave in predictable ways due to their environment. He wrote a book, Skinner, Walled In Two, where the society was shaped, not Walled In Two, Erewhon, which was the inverse of Walled In Two, where there was a utopian society shaped by positive reinforcement. So this idea that there's no free will, if I know a stimulus or a trigger, I can get a behavioral output. That is very much Skinner, but it's also very much James Mill. So trying to understand the mind, you break it down into its elements, sensations and ideas. Again, the sensation ideas are topics that a lot of these British empiricists are discussing. So the mind is purely mechanistic. We learn, or complex ideas come through association, whether it be at the same time or in simultaneously or successive, doesn't matter. And the mind is passive. The mind is a machine, right? So it operates like a machine. Mill suggested no, it is a machine, and the mind has no creative function. we now know this is not true. So if you look at positive psychology and the role of creativity on well-being, it rejects this notion that the mind is not creative. So John Stuart Mill was the son of James Mill, and he was treated as if he was a blank slate. So he adopted John Locke's philosophy. And because if knowledge is acquired through experience, then he was drilled and drilled and drilled by his father to make sure that he memorized random facts. And in terms of his cognitive abilities, it did help. And many people suggested that he was a genius. By 3, he was reading Plato in Greek. By 11, he wrote his first publication. And by 12, he understood the college curriculum of a bachelor's degree. So all of these things would suggest that his cognitive abilities were far more advanced than the average person. Where he differed from a lot of people in his day was that he promoted women's rights. So he's an early feminist. He rejects the male superiority myth and suggests that women should be treated equal to men. Now, so in terms of his philosophy, he also rejects his dad's idea of complex ideas, because if you remember, James Mill said complex ideas are just smushing together a couple simple ideas, right? And it's just the combination. There's nothing more than that, right? Well, John Stuart Mill says that's not true. Our complex ideas are novel and they're creative. So he rejects his dad's idea that there's no creativity. And this creative synthesis allows for new ideas to occur. And he refers to this as mental chemistry. Now, you may have heard the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That is a Gestalt idea. But John Stuart Mill would agree with that based on his principle of creative synthesis, that when you combine things together, it's not additive, it's multiplicative sometimes. So he felt that, when you put different elements together, you can have a chemical reaction. And similar to chemistry, we could study the mind that way. So what are some of the contributions that we start to see of empiricism to psychology? Well, atomistic. So it's very atomistic, is more focusing on an element. Mechanistic, which is more structural, and positivistic, which is over experience. So empiricism acknowledges sensation. It breaks down the conscious experience to its elements and allows for synthesis to occur, or complex ideas to occur through association. But it focuses on your conscious experience versus the unconscious. So you could see the British empiricists and their ideas rolling out later in psychology. So empiricism did a lot, but it was also augmented by experimental physiology. And experimental physiology, we refer to the German physiologists because there's a lot of things happening with experimental physiology in Germany. So we'll talk about that next lecture. But let's see how we do. I'm going to go through some key terms and see what you know. So can I get, I took my slideshow off, so I can't even see my words. Give me 1 second. Can I get a good definition of mechanism?
It's natural processes that are mechanically determined and can be explained by the laws of physics and chemistry.
Did you read that or did you remember that?
I read it, honestly.
Well, but that's fine. Obviously, you're going to want to know it cold for a test. But think about a machine. The root of mechanism is machine. So there are these physical structures that get put together. So we should be able to explain things in physical terms. So that's mechanism. Rosa Marie, you have your hand up.
Can we say like it's responsible for like specific changes in psychological outcomes? Or is that still like,
Yeah, but a lot of the things, determinism and, would also be, we'd be able to say that too. It's what I'm saying is your explanation would be appropriate for mechanism, but it could be for other things too. Determinism. Who's got a good definition of determinism?
It's the idea that there's like no free will.
Right on. Reductionism, also known as atomism, right? What is reductionism?
It's the idea that you can break things down.
So it's more elemental parts, right? So into small structure. And when you think of reductionism or atoms, an atom is a very small structure. So we should be able to break things down into its smallest parts. Automata. Who's got a good one?
Mechanical devices built to imitate human and animal movement.
Love it. Great definition.
Okay.
Empiricism. Knowledge is acquired through direct experience or observation. The mind-body problem. What's the mind?
Sorry. Just how the body and the mind like work together. So if the mind influences the body or vice versa.
And before Descartes, Chloe, what was the belief set?
Before Descartes, it was that the mind influences the body and not like the other way.
Right on. And what did Descartes add? And I'm gonna leave you alone after this.
Wasn't it that damn, I forgot.
I'll give you a hint. Dualism. Does that?
Oh, so it's like, it's like the mutual interaction. So the body influences the mind as well as the mind influences the body.
Exactly. Reflex action theory. This was his explanation on how the mind and body interact. And you may remember that cartoon graphic of the tube going from the foot all the way to the pineal gland and back. Laura, then Chastity.
External stimuli invokes involuntary responses from us.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Innate ideas.
Is it that you're born with knowledge?
Yeah. Okay, so, and who adopted the doctrine of innate ideas?
Plato.
Okay, and in the Renaissance, I was looking for someone else.
His name is Descartes.
Descartes, again. So, yeah, it is Descartes. Derived ideas. Derived ideas.
They occur from immediate application of an external stimulus.
So we would talk about experience, right? Let's see. Positivism.
It's the idea that all facts about society are observable
Right.
and objective.
And who can that be attributed to?
Comte.
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 the E is, it's not your fault. Listen, a lot of these names we have to acquire, but the E is silent, right? So yeah, Auguste Comte. Materialism. What is materialism?
The universe can be explained in like physical terms.
Right? Similar to physics and chemistry, right? So that's materialism. Simple and complex ideas we have already. Association. What does the word association mean?
Linking, I guess.
Go for it.
I was saying it's linking something.
Yeah, it's how we link ideas. Now, what were the three ways we link ideas?
Similarity, frequency, and contiguity.
Contiguity, yeah. So those are your three. So know those three. Now, similarity is resemblance, right? Creative synthesis. Who's that? John Stuart Mill, in rejection of his father's idea that our conscious experience, our complex ideas, are more than just a combination of simple ideas. Let's pick. I'm not gonna do all of them because I think you should know them all, but I'm just gonna pick some. Julian de la Mettrie. You heard his name twice.
He took artificial intelligence to the next level. Like,
Yeah, and he basically that man is a machine, right? Similar to James Mill, right? So Julian de la Mettrie and James Mill suggested that, yeah, he talks about AI and machines being, able to run the world, but in terms of James Mill, our mind is a machine, and there's nothing creative about it. Charles Babbage.
He was a pioneer in the development of artificial intelligence.
A tabulating machine. Babbage was the one who developed the calculating machine.
The first digital computer.
Exactly. I'm gonna stop there, but how are you feeling? I think that now is a good time to take the pulse and see